It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Shayak Sengupta, who actually joined ORF America last month. It's been like 3 weeks.
Yesterday was my 1 month anniversary. So,
congratulations. Yeah. And he joined as a fellow, leading our research on energy, climate, and sustainability. Previously, Dr. Sengupta worked as a visiting researcher at the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. So, Shayak, the floor is yours.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Sharon. Let me make sure I'm getting picked up. Thank you, Sharon. So it's great to have a good turnout, and we have a great panel lined up today to talk about U.S. energy cooperation with the developing world. So I'll just kind of go one by one and introduce each of our panel members before we kind of dive in. So we first have Katie Auth, who is Policy Director for Energy for Growth Hub, a network dedicated to high energy futures for the world's energy poor. She was previously Deputy Coordinator for Power Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Next, we have Varun Sivaram, who is currently Senior Director for Clean Energy and Innovation at the Office of the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, which is housed at the U.S. Department of State. He was previously Chief Technology Officer at Renew Power, one of India's leading renewable energy companies. And third on our panel is we have Andrew Light, who is Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. He was previously Senior Advisor and India Counselor to the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change, also at the U.S. Department of State, however, in the previous Obama administration. So I will kind of go, dive deep and say that, given the recent events, with Ukraine, much of the conversation here in Washington when it comes to energy and energy security and climate have focused on Europe. And when I was thinking about framing this panel, what does this mean for the developing world, for the global South, for hundreds of countries that have not sanctioned Russia in any way? And so I wanted to frame our discussion by noting three challenges before I start the questions. First, is in the short term, the war in Ukraine means higher global energy prices. And that means a lot of countries are re-examining not only what it means to be dependent on imported oil and gas, but then also they're re-examining their relations with Russia. In the medium term, we have the pandemic that's still ongoing, especially for millions in the global South who are not vaccinated yet. So the International Energy Agency recently came out with a report that said that energy access around the world had been set back due to the pandemic. And then we also have the longer term challenge of climate change in a warming world and the need for energy transitions. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also came out with a recent report saying we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions quickly enough. So a lot of different things to think about when it comes to the developing world. So the first set of questions I wanted to ask were on the short term. So how the war in Ukraine and the current state of global energy markets affects developing countries. And so for Andrew, my question for you is, what role do you see U.S. energy cooperation with the developing world, given the challenge of higher energy prices from this war?
Thanks very much, and it's great to be here with everyone. And this is my first time in ORF America, so I know it's been a while, but congratulations to everyone who's created this branch of this great institution here in the United States. So look, the role of the United States is essential with respect to what's going on in energy markets writ large, and especially with how they impact poor people around the world, with developing countries, with respect to income inequality in the United States as well. And I should say that one of the things that we've done, and I think it's very clear that the Biden administration made a commitment to putting the information out on what we were seeing was going to happen in Ukraine early. That was part of our strategy. It's very transparent now. Everyone knows it. We did not want a repeat of what happened with the invasion of Crimea, with some kind of plausible deniability of who was causing chaos in the region. And that was very intentional and very clear. And if you think about that and what an office like International Affairs, the Department of Energy does, we have been modeling 7 ways to Sunday the different impacts that were going to happen, not only in the Ukraine, but also in Europe and in the rest of the world, could happen with respect to this unjustified, completely unnecessary war of choice by Vladimir Putin. And we modeled it from just the thinking about what will happen just, for example, if one or another gas pipeline were to shut down coming from Russia. We modeled what would happen if all of the gas coming out of Russia were to be shut down. We modeled what would be the impacts of all the sanctions that you're seeing wave after wave after wave come forward, so we would know what was going to happen. Because we know a couple things that are true, that Vladimir Putin makes money off of energy. This is as much an energy war as it is any other kind of war. And so we cannot allow him to continue to get rich and then use those funds to prosecute this war, which is actually impacting all of us. And so we've been looking at measures in many different ways. So from the broad global perspective, what you've seen from March 1st to April 1st, to take an example of a global intervention that we were engaged in, which was aimed at helping the entire world, not just the United States, was the historic 2 back-to-back collective actions from the International Energy Agency to release 180 million barrels of oil into the world to try to stabilize global oil prices, because the last thing we want now, as we're recovering from a recession caused by COVID, is the creation of another recession caused by this war. And so that's why we decided to do interventions like that. That is historic. To put this in perspective, this is 3 times larger than any historic collective release of oil before, of which previously there had only been 3. So it's extraordinary to see, it's 31 countries under the IEA who came together to work on that issue and to come together and to try to make those kinds of things happen. And then on the full other end of the spectrum, then it's every single thing we're doing to help every developing country we can. And at the Department of Energy, we oversee some 36 bilateral energy partnerships or energy councils or energy thises or that's, mostly at the ministerial level, to help countries, and all of them, I should say, since President Biden and Vice President Harris assumed office, that most of them focused on, obviously, decarbonizing the energy sector. And before that was certainly focused on climate change. Now it is as much focused on diversifying supply. Because the last thing I think anyone wants right now, which is what has been absolutely apparent from what's going on with Ukraine, is you do not want to be the subject of an energy system that can be weaponized against you. And so in that respect, we have got to make sure we do everything possible that we can for every developing country in the world to make sure that they do not wind up in the same position that, frankly, the Europeans have been in since the beginning of this incursion.
Great, thank you. So I had a follow-up question. So much of, again, the conversation is focused on LNG, and some of that has been rerouted from Asia to Europe. And so in your modeling scenarios, is there a potential for some of that LNG that would have gone to Asia to displace something dirty like coal to kind of rebound climate-wise, saying, if a lot of these countries don't have that LNG available, they'll use whatever is available to them. Sometimes that's coal.
You've absolutely got to look at that. So I'd sort of say that two things on this. Number one, and Varun and I worked on this together, one of the things that we did early on in the Biden administration, maybe from day one, and I was there starting on Inauguration Day, was we created a new energy guidance. And the new energy guidance was to shift U.S. energy diplomacy away from fossil energy towards either renewables, nuclear, right, or decarbonized fossils, right? So some kind of abated fossil energy, with the exceptions in the cases of energy security and energy poverty. So that was our new energy guidance, because I think that it's fair to say that the energy policy in the United States for the last 12 years, not just the last 4 years prior to this administration, had primarily been focused on natural gas with renewables and nuclear as well, but certainly gas was there always at the forefront. We are committed to creating the greenest, cleanest gas supply in the world. We are committed to creating opportunities for abated fossil energy in the world, and that was all before Ukraine. And now what we see is that the last thing, again, that you want to see is as you're in the middle of a real energy transition, and we are in an actual energy transition now, we're not just talking about it anymore, is that you can't let supply fall off for people in the energy systems that they are in right now, while at the same time making the transition, because you will lose all support for the transition, and then you have to start all over again if you're lucky. And so with that respect, yes, there's been a focus on that, and you've seen that with respect to the announcement that was made, 4 weeks ago by President von der Leyen and President Biden on this energy task force that's been created. Mostly, at least half of it is to look like ways in which we can reroute more LNG to Europe as they look at ways to get out of the trap that they're in under President Putin, while at the same time getting them off of gas in the long run. So we've got to walk and chew gum. This is what it means to be in an actual transition. You can't just abandon the energy systems that people are in right now and the amazing gains, especially in the developing world, that they've made on the backs of that energy. But at the same time, you've got to orient towards a transition. You've got to accelerate that transition. You've got to manage that transition. And so I think that it puts us all in a position that, frankly, I never thought I would be in terms of some of the measures and conversations that I've been around. But it is absolutely essential to do that in order to make that transition happen, to be in this world again where we can live in energy systems that can't be weaponized.
Great, thank you. So Katie, my next question is for you. So you and your colleague Todd Moss recently wrote a piece outlining the war's effect on energy transitions in Africa. So can you shed some light on specific impacts the war will have on U.S. policy in the region when it comes to energy, and how Africa will develop in its need for energy?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So Todd and I wrote this piece because, as you've said, so much of the media focus and dialogue has been centered on Europe and the US and those energy impacts. And it's important to recognize that, the ripple effects of this crisis are much, much broader than that. And that truly energy poor countries, like those in Africa, are actually undergoing their own transitions, which look quite a bit different from the one that we're undergoing. So we covered a lot in that article, but I'll pull out kind of 3 of the main points that we tried to make. First is that I think you'll see African leaders start to frame the challenge of energy poverty increasingly in terms of energy security. So a lot of the Ukraine related energy dialogue has been about energy security and the urgency with which we need to address that issue, particularly as it impacts Europe. I think you will start to see calls to view energy poverty as probably the worst and most extreme form of energy insecurity, and something that needs to be addressed with the same type of urgency and coordinated speed that we are dealing with what Europe is facing. The second issue is around prices, which is obviously an issue globally, but I think the impacts are slightly different in African economies. So first, the rising price of oil, we tend to think of as mostly impacting gasoline prices and some other things. In African markets, actually quite a bit of electricity generation is also derived from oil. So whether that's a West African country using heavy fuel oil in large-scale utility plants, or whether it's the fact that in more than 17 African countries, there's more capacity in the form of diesel generators than there is on the entire grid, which is pretty crazy. So you're seeing oil prices impact power in a way that's going to make it increasingly difficult for African businesses and households to survive and function, frankly. And second is that the prices on gas are obviously hitting their energy markets in the same way that they are elsewhere. But the follow-on point to gas, which I think Andrew touched on a bit, is there has been a bit of a diplomatic challenge for the US and others in talking to African countries about this balance between short-term energy needs and a long-term decarbonization effort. And the energy policy that you guys put together, I think, is actually quite good, and it does have carve-outs that recognize, the need to have some flexibility for gas in cases of energy poverty. The problem is that a lot of that nuance has been lost when that guidance has been interpreted overseas. And so you've seen a lot of anger and concern on the part of African governments who see rich countries essentially limiting the development finance available for gas. And I think that's going to potentially worsen now that there's so much effort to diversify Europe's gas supply sometimes even looking at options to export from Africa, unless we can really get that messaging right and communicate that the U.S. does support flexibility and is putting in place measures to make sure that we're looking at both short and long-term gains. And I think that needs to be a focus of U.S. agencies now.
Great, great. So the last question when it comes to kind of short-term impacts from this war, my question next is for Varun. Andrew touched upon this a little bit, but so much of the U.S. policy responses have been to higher energy prices have focused on fossil fuels, understandably. But how do you see these short-term U.S. policies balance with the medium and long-term need to deploy future clean energy technologies, especially in the global south?
Thanks, Shayak. And let me first say congratulations to you, to Dhruva, to Samir on ORF America. It's just fantastic to see this launched here. Thanks for having me. And the question you raise is appropriate. I want to echo what Andrew concluded by saying, which is what this latest crisis has demonstrated, this unprovoked invasion by Russia of Ukraine, what it's demonstrated is a real opportunity in the clean energy transition, as well as some risks that we'll have to mitigate. The real opportunity is, the need for climate action has not changed before and after the crisis. If anything, it intensifies every day that we don't act as fast as we should. But the opportunities are highlighted in sharper focus because the true path to energy security that's enduring, both in the developed and the developing world, is a future where we aren't reliant on imports of unabated fossil fuels. And the clean energy technologies that will enable us to transform economies have the potential to make us more energy secure. Secretary Kerry has been very clear about framing this dual win about energy security and the clean energy transition. Now, you asked, Shayak, are there long-term clean energy technology plays in response to the short-term crisis? Well, there are short-term clean energy technology plays in response to this crisis. Renewable energy in most of the world is actually the cheapest new form of electricity generation. Between now and 2030, in order to meet our climate objectives, we need to reduce the world's emissions by close to half to stay on track to keep the 1.5-degree global warming limit in reach. And right now, in most parts of the world, tomorrow I think New Delhi will be hearing us speak. In India, solar energy is not only the cheapest form of new generation, solar energy is actually cheaper to build in India than anywhere else in the world. So there is an immediate near-term opportunity to invest in clean energy. And to reach our 2030 targets, 80% of the reductions we need to get to are from technologies we already have and that are ready to deploy. And then the other opportunity that this energy crisis highlights is that in parts of the energy transition where we really haven't made as much progress as in renewables in the power sector, there's now a real impetus to invest in the technologies that we'll need, because it's not just going to be about reducing fossil fuel use in the power sector to reach energy security goals. It's about reducing oil use in the transportation sector, or as Katie mentioned, in the power sector in some countries. It's about reducing fossil fuel use, coal, gas, and oil in the industry sector. And we do need those technologies that so far often aren't commercially as competitive with fossil fuels, haven't made as much progress as we made in the power sector. And so therefore, in this decade, we need to invest in the technologies that are critical so that by 2050, we'll reach net zero, not just in power, but across transportation and industry as well. And 50% of the emission reductions, according to the IEA, that we'll need for net zero in 2050 will come from technologies that aren't yet ready for market today. So there's a huge opportunity in these hard-to-abate sectors that account for roughly a third or 30% of global emissions today, but on business as usual will rise to about 50% by 2050 if we don't take immediate action now. So that's really the opportunity. And the risk, very briefly, is, as Andrew mentioned, we've got to make sure that we are tackling both demand and supply in a coherent fashion. Particularly in these transportation, the industry sector, we have to be tackling we have to have opportunities to invest in clean energy technologies to reduce demand for unabated fossil fuels just as quickly as the supply of unabated fossil fuels falls, because a mismatch can lead to price imbalances, and we've seen that not just this year but also last year and in years previously. Let me pause there.
No, that was great. I want to touch upon one thing. So you mentioned, that our dependence on fossil fuels makes us, dependent on parts of the world that we probably shouldn't be dependent on. But I wanted to get even Andrew's thoughts on this. China controls so much of our clean energy kind of supply chains when it comes to critical minerals. The reason why we have cheap solar around the world is because a lot of those panels come from China. And so where do you see kind of the U.S. in its role with vis-a-vis China, right? Because yes, while we will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels that may come from places that we don't like, are we just swapping some of that risk for, clean energy technologies that also come from somewhere we may not like?
Well, you could be,
Yeah.
right? Absolutely, that's the worry, which is why we've got to go into the transition wide-eyed and ready to make sure that doesn't happen. And if you look at, let's just take the supply chain issues there, which have got a lot of attention, obviously, in the last year, prior to the outbreak of the war in Europe, with respect to questions about the nature of the supply chain, especially on the polysilicon area coming out of China, and the concerns that we had there, and the creation of, withhold release orders and stuff that had to go forward, given the sort of the public understanding that we had about the use of forced labor with respect to the supply chain there. There are so many reasons there. We need to not only diversify. We got to do three things: diversify our supply chain when it comes to clean energy, so that we aren't beholden on one country in the same way that Europe has become beholden on Russia with respect to fossils. Number two, we need to rebuild U.S. supply chains there, and there's a huge effort going on there. A lot of it you can sort of find in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, and we've reoriented the Department of Energy, in fact, to help to sort of work on exactly problems like that, hiring 1,000 people, renaming one of our undersecretary positions, and sort of working on those kinds of issues. And the third thing we have to do is get very creative about what we can do here. And the one thing I'll mention on this sort of the creativity bucket is Secretary Granholm, the Secretary of Energy in the U.S., was the chair of this year's International Energy Agency Ministerial, which just happened, about a month ago. Again, everything seems like a year ago at this point. In Paris, and again, the 31 countries of the IA. And if you look at it, encourage everyone to look at the sort of the ministerial communique there, which was 31, just like the G20 or the G7, in this case, 31 countries had to come to consensus on all 42 paragraphs, I believe, of that communique, and my team sort of led on sort of the creation of that. In there, you'll find a section on critical minerals and materials which calls for to start with, a voluntary stockpiling program for critical minerals to mirror the required stockpiling program for oil and fossil fuels, which was what the International Energy Agency was originally created 50 years ago to do. And so I think you see there all of those countries recognizing exactly the kind of the worry, right, Shayak, that you just mentioned. It's like we don't want to find ourselves in that position. That means we've got to get creative. That means we've got to sort of make sure that there's no future cartel, for example, that would potentially put us all in a corner when it comes to those building blocks for a clean energy future.
Great. Varun, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just quickly, I think Andrew said it perfectly well. I don't have much to add to that, except to say there is a balance that we're going to have to walk around the world between the desire to produce things domestically in many different countries, and the need for the free flow of clean energy goods that keeps prices low, because that's what's fueled the clean energy transition to date. And as we navigate this balance, it'll be important to build these supply chains, in our case, among our partners and allies, to build the supply chains that we can count on, that we can trust, and to work with countries, as Secretary Granholm has led through the IEA, to work with countries collectively on strategic reserves, for example. That's why Secretary Kerry was very supportive of this evolution of the IEA's mandate. But my point is, if we move toward autarky for every country making their own clean energy minerals, and making sure that domestic supply chains are walled off, you will have substantially higher clean energy prices. And that is a risk we have to mitigate.
Absolutely.
Great. So now I want to kind of move the discussion to kind of setbacks from the pandemic. As I mentioned before, the IEA said that the pandemic has reversed progress on access to electricity and clean cooking. However, renewable investment has remained resilient. And so question for you, Katie, is how can the U.S. engage to address these energy setbacks from the pandemic, especially to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which have the 2030 target? And if you want to kind of explain what those are a little bit beforehand, I feel like you can do that better than I can. So.
Sure. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of global targets that essentially try to drive progress towards things that are collectively seen as critical to improvements in quality of life and development around the world. And SDG 7 focuses on electricity access. And I think the effects of what you're alluding to, the fact that we have seen setbacks, it's really illustrated the fact that the gains we've made over the past decade, and we have made gains, in part because of the US and other development partners who really put a huge emphasis on solving energy poverty. The fact that we've seen them fall back illustrates that in reality, they're quite fragile. And in my opinion, there's kind of two big things to consider here. The first is that many of the programs, the international development efforts, the SDG-focused programs over the past decade have focused on a relatively narrow definition of what ending energy poverty means. If you look at how even SDG 7 itself is defined, it focuses on, is someone connected to electricity or not? Do they consume a bare minimum of power that gives them, the first building block of what modern energy access actually means? And when you look at the metrics that have been adopted even by Power Africa, which is the US's kind of signature African energy initiative, that also focuses on, is someone connected to power or not? The problem with that is that when an economic, something happens economically that puts people's incomes at risk or changes the market, a connection is worthless if you can't afford the power that's provided, or if the power itself is of such a poor quality that you're unable to use it to power economic activity or to do something meaningful. So I think the first thing that we have to do is think about energy poverty more broadly, to link it to economic development agendas, to focus on not just is a person connected, but is a person connected to affordable, reliable electricity. And the second thing is, you mentioned that renewable investment actually hasn't taken a hit. If you pull out emerging and frontier economies, that's actually not quite true. So the share of investment going into African countries has actually come down. And I think there's many factors around that, but I think it points to the fact that the US really has to focus on building markets that are attracting capital into the clean energy space, and that progressively rely less and less on kind of the heavy guarantees and subsidies that are now being kind of applied by development banks and others to make projects viable. And the big thing I will close by saying is that a lot of that comes down to helping countries procure power in a different way so that they are procuring clean energy competitively in ways that bring prices down, in ways that bring in developers who want to be part of a growing market. Right now, most power projects in Africa are actually negotiated bilaterally behind closed doors. There's very little transparency into how projects, whether they're clean or fossil fuels, are actually brought online. And I think opening that up will be a huge market mover.
Great. Thank you for shedding light on the Africa piece of that, because you see the top line kind of conclusion, but it is, you realize it's geographically varied. So before we go for questions, kind of the last bucket of questions I wanted to ask our panelists was just thinking about the climate and energy transitions broadly. I know we've touched upon these topics in their responses, but my next question is for Andrew. So if you have not followed, so the Department of Energy is one of the premier technical agencies with its network of national labs and research that it funds in the United States. And recently launched an initiative called Net Zero World to help developing countries achieve net zero targets. And so, Andrew, could you provide a little bit more information on that, as well as how you see the U.S. providing technical assistance? I know a lot of it focuses on the diplomacy and the finance, but actually getting folks on the ground knowledgeable about how to carry out this transition.
Sure. I'll try to be real brief so we can get to questions, and encourage anyone who's interested in more information to reach out to my office, or you can immediately go to the Net Zero World website that we have already put up. But we created Net Zero World, and it was launched at the COP, the last COP in Glasgow. Secretary Kerry was there to launch with Secretary Granholm, and the U.S. and the Department of Energy leads this initiative, which involves a bunch of different parts of the U.S. government, including USAID and state and Treasury and Development Finance Corporation, and a pretty long list. And most importantly, 10 of our 17 national labs, which are really the crown jewels of innovation, and research, especially on energy, I would sort of argue in the world, certainly in the United States. The focus of it is this. The idea is that to get to a net zero world, you don't need every single country in the world to get to net zero by 2050. But you do need those representing at least 75% north, right, of global emissions. And so the two buckets of countries that we focus on is, number one, developing countries in the G20, and number two, developing countries and others that we think can become net clean energy exporters in the region. And so we've got approximate idea of around 20 or so countries that would sort of fit this description, that if you put them all together and they got to net zero by 2050, then you create a net zero world. Now, we're not asking any country to sort of say, all right, in order to be part of this, we've got to adopt a net zero 2050 target. That's Varun's department and his office to do the target setting. What we're doing is sort of focusing on demonstrating to them that they actually can get to net zero by 2050 by creating these comprehensive maps that look at the entire economy, that show how sector by sector by sector, institution by institution even, grid block by grid block, what would be the sort of the policies and measures that you would need to actually get to net zero by 2050. This is not a comprehensive mammoth report that we do by ourselves. Of course, we do it with lots of collaborators around the world, both public and private and NGOs. And it is done entirely in collaboration with countries that decide to take it on. This is not a piece of work that you do. Unfortunately, in my mostly NGO career, I have been responsible for writing a lot of reports that I throw over the transom and hope for the best, with some follow-up meetings, but really something that we co-create with these countries, right? And importantly, in addition to the technical piece, right, which is absolutely right, there is also, these are roadmaps about investment. It's not just, here's the technological pathway, which is kind of, frankly, you can take out the fossils and put in some other stuff and presto, right? You get to net zero, but what is it that's going to actually be to attract the capital? And I think this is exactly to the last point. That's where we've got the biggest gap. What's going to attract the capital there in order to see a return, in order to create affordable energy for folks who decide to do it? There is certainly a diplomacy side, because there's the upfront negotiation and also the execution that we will do continuously through my office, through Varun's, through USAID, through Treasury, DFC, all of our partners, to actually watch whether or not these things are actually getting implemented. So we started, and I'll stop with this, we started with 6 countries, Indonesia, Argentina, Chile, Egypt, Nigeria, and Ukraine. Those were the ones that were launched. We're now sort of in conversation with a bunch of very important countries, hopefully some of which are listening in to this broadcast today or tomorrow. And this, we think, is an incredible opportunity, again, to create surety of investment for these kinds of pathways that are co-created with these countries to get them there. It is, frankly, the most exciting thing I've ever been a part of in my professional life. And we are all, I think, dedicated, right, in the interagency and with lots of stakeholder partners to sort of see this as a success.
Great. Yeah, that makes me excited. I'm really excited to see what roadmaps you come out with. I think last question before we ask the audience for questions is for Katie. So Andrew touched a little bit about the finance. I know finance has been a big piece since COP26. But can you give us your thoughts on what the role of either public or private finance is to address energy transition? What forms will this finance take? if you want to get technical, debt, equity, you know, where do you see the money flowing? Because we know it's not enough, right? But how do we get, you know, at least the amount that we can get flowing? What will it look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, unsurprisingly, both public and private finance are going to play huge roles in this if we are successful. And I do want to call out again African economies as being slightly different, because I think that, you know, a lot of the attention and the focus within U.S. government policymaking, including when I was at USAID helping to run Power Africa, a lot of it has been about how do we catalyze private capital into these markets, which is a very important goal, and certainly makes sense when you're talking about developing countries in the G20 and some of the more mature markets that are really ready for that. There are a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere around the world where there's a lot of public investment that still needs to happen in order to enable an energy system that can actually absorb high shares of renewable power, which is, you know, where we all want to get. And I think that sometimes gets lost in some of the policy conversations. So, you know, there was a study from Center for Global Development recently which looked at investment in infrastructure across all developing markets, and more than 80% of it was public. And if you look at energy, it's a similar share. And so one of the most exciting spaces to think about from my perspective is how can the US enter into longer term partnerships with African economies or those in similar positions where they're at the very early stages of developing their energy markets, and really put in place the foundational infrastructure that's going to enable that as quickly as possible. So grid infrastructure is a great example where grids are still public across the vast majority of Africa, but they're absolutely vital to getting to a place where private capital can actually come in and invest in wind and solar. And so I think those types of ecosystem investments on the public side are going to be crucial. And it's a space where, to date, not as much focus and attention has been on it. So I'm excited to see that move forward.
Great, great. So I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions for our panelists, feel free. I think the mic is over there.
Hi, thanks so much. Jennifer Lakey, Global Energy Director, World Resources Institute. I'm part of a partnership with the International Solar Alliance that has been looking to scale solar in developing countries, and I know the United States has been watching this and supporting India in its leadership role with that effort. And I'm curious about the dynamics that may be shifting with regards to those kinds of multi-country initiatives, knowing that things like the G20 are going to be tricky this year with the Russia and Ukraine conflict. And my second question is, how then do you need partners that can help to create that kind of a programming or support for efforts that are government-led?
I'm happy to jump in on the ISA. A few of us were just in India, actually talking with the ISA at COP26 last year. Secretary Kerry and Environment Minister for India, Yadav, jointly signed our joining document. So we're thrilled to join the ISA. The ISA is an important institution for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's led by India, which is an emerging economy that has been just absolutely at the forefront of the renewable energy transition. And in a sense, what India has done has become a model, a template for emerging economies around the world to follow, which is why we're delighted to see India's leadership on the ISA. I think I just read in Q1 of 2022, India deployed a record 4.1 gigawatts of solar. So they've come out of the pandemic, really installing a great deal of solar, and we want to now replicate this model. India was early in the auctions process, for example. We want to replicate auctions around the world. So a lot of the work the ISA is doing around the world, including in many of the economies, Katie, you've been speaking about, is to systematize some of the successes and then bring what is a very successful policy, regulatory, financial, and technical toolkit for how do you organize an auction, what is the process for concluding, signing, and finalizing a PPA, How do you do permitting very effectively? And how do you make these investments truly bankable, not just for local, but also international investors? So we're particularly excited to collaborate with them. And also take your point that this is an example of an institution that's kind of purpose-built to invest in solar in the developing world. We're hugely supportive of it. And it's an important part both of our bilateral work with India, as well as now as we engage with it and support it, our work with a range of other countries that complements some of the net zero world work that Andrew just mentioned.
I'd say one quick thing, Jennifer. It's great to see my former colleague from WRI, Jennifer. I hope that I did not give the impression that multilateral cooperation is not important to us or is less important now because of what's going on. It's actually way more important. What's going on now, in fact, on the sanction side is, if nothing, an exercise in multilateral cooperation. Sometimes it is sort of on-the-spot collaborations, right? So sometimes it is more formal, as we've seen in the G7. And there's definitely, I would certainly never disagree with the idea that there's going to be some difficult times in some of these institutions. But at the same time, because we're in the middle of a transition and we've all got to pull together, some of these institutions like ISA and others, which are sort of bottom up, those who want to join kind of forms of multilateralism, are so much more important than they've ever have been. And so with that, I invite everyone to come to Pittsburgh in September for the joint the Clean Energy Ministerial Process and Mission Innovation, which Secretary Granholm will chair. And if any of you have followed those processes, which were both created in the Obama administration, the Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation. And let me tell you, and there was the prep meeting for that meeting that we were just at in India, my team and Varun's team, and what you're going to see is a supercharge there, really focused not on let's get together and have some interesting, polite conversations on hydrogen or biofuels or efficiency or what have you, but let's get down to brass tacks and how do you deploy as soon as possible every single bit of this, and how do you put together the collections on innovation that makes sense, because it makes no sense for the United States to have 15 different innovation partnerships with 15 different countries. We've got to put all the countries together who want to take on these problems in shipping or in hydrogen or in carbon capture and put the best minds together to make sure you actually do rapidly accelerate these technologies, which are absolutely essential to hit net zero.
So if we can take one more question, and I think that will be our last question since Andrew has a hard stop at 4.
Hi, Prashant Jha from the Hindustan Times. How do you assure the developing world that US's commitment to the clean energy transition and to helping the developing world with climate finance is going to endure beyond your administration? In the first panel, we heard about Indo-Pacific, and there is a bipartisan commitment there, which has endured across administrations. Climate is not an area where you have a domestic political consensus. And so there is a sense that, look, what happens in 2 years? And are you creating structures which are going to outlast the administration that you serve?
And I'd love to hear Andrew's thoughts on this too. I just want to assure you that the investments we've put in place in our bilateral partnerships with countries in the developing world, given you're coming from the Hindustan Times, I'll mention India, are designed to be those that are in our mutual interest and that should absolutely endure for many, many years and decades to come. Andrew and I have both worked on the US-India Agenda 2030 partnership. And the motivating driver behind this is India's own goals. For example, to develop 500 gigawatts of non-fossil power capacity by 2030. Motivations behind the work that we do jointly come, for example, from India's own economic opportunity. India could be the world's largest market for solar PV, for batteries. It could have the world's cheapest green hydrogen. India has its own green hydrogen roadmap, and Andrew and his office have launched a hydrogen collaboration. So a lot of the work that we do together with India under the DOE work or under what Secretary Kerry leads, which is the Climate Action and Finance Mobilization Dialogue, are keyed to what the priorities have been of our interlocutors in a way that's apolitical. It is we want to achieve rapid climate action and meet our partners' economic objectives at the same time. So I have every confidence that our joint dialogues are going to endure for a long time to come.
Great. Well, if we could, do you have anything
No,
to
that's
add?
a good place to end.
I think this is a good place to stop. If we could give our panelists a round of applause. And before everyone does that, coffee break is going to happen right after this, so feel free to grab a cup of coffee after this.